January 8th, 1811, just before midnight. The German Coast, Louisiana. Rain hammers the sugarcane fields. Cold wind cuts through the darkness. Charles Deslondes stands in the shadows outside the Andry mansion, 36 miles upriver from New Orleans. His heart pounds. His hands grip a cane knife. Behind him, 25 men wait. Men he has been recruiting in secret for months. Men who know that what happens in the next few minutes will determine whether they live as free men or die as examples. Inside that mansion sleeps Manuel Andry, one of the largest slaveholders in the parish. Andry trusts Charles completely. Why wouldn't he? Charles runs his plantation. Charles keeps the other workers in line. Charles has never given him a single reason to doubt his loyalty. Andry has no idea what Charles has been doing in the quiet hours, the whispered conversations, the secret meetings, the network stretching across dozens of plantations. The plan to do what no one in American history has ever done: organize hundreds of enslaved people into an army and march on a major city. Tonight that plan becomes real. If they succeed in the next hour, they will seize weapons from the basement. They will recruit from every plantation between here and New Orleans. They will grow from 25 men to hundreds. They will march in military formation with drums and flags. They will make white Louisiana tremble. If they fail, they will die. Not quickly. The death reserved for rebellious black men in Louisiana is designed to terrorize, to send a message. Their bodies will become warnings. Charles looks at his men, gives the signal. They move toward the door. To understand what Charles Deslondes is about to accomplish, you need to understand what white Louisiana believed about the people they held in bondage. They believed rebellion on this scale was impossible. Not unlikely, impossible. The German coast was the richest sugar-producing region in North America. Plantation owners here had built a system designed to prevent exactly what Charles was planning. They controlled the roads. They controlled the rivers. They controlled communication between plantations. They had militias, weapons, and the full backing of the United States government. More importantly, they believed the people they enslaved were incapable of organizing anything this complex. In their minds, black people could work. Black people could obey. But black people could not plan, could not coordinate, could not lead. This arrogance was their greatest weakness. Charles Deslondes had lived his entire life watching white men underestimate him. Born around 1789 on a Louisiana plantation, he grew up learning how to survive in a system designed to crush him. He learned when to speak and when to stay silent. He learned how to read white men's fears and expectations. He learned how to become exactly what they wanted to see. By 1811, Charles had risen to the position of driver on Manuel Andry's plantation. A driver supervised other enslaved workers. He answered directly to the master. He carried a whip. To white eyes, a driver was the most loyal, most trusted, most controlled black man on any plantation. What they never understood was that a driver also had something no other enslaved person had: freedom of movement. Charles could travel between plantations without suspicion. He could speak with workers across the entire German coast. He could build a network right under their noses. And that is exactly what he did. For months, Charles had been holding secret meetings, in the quarters after dark, in the fields during work, at gatherings where enslaved people from different plantations came together. He spoke of Haiti, where black people had risen up and defeated Napoleon's army. He spoke of freedom. He spoke of a plan. The obstacles he faced were overwhelming. The German coast stretched along the Mississippi River, with plantations on both banks. White families had weapons in their homes. The territorial militia could be mobilized within hours. New Orleans had a military garrison. Federal troops were stationed nearby. Any uprising would face professional soldiers with artillery. No large-scale rebellion had ever succeeded on American soil. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina had been crushed within a day. The conspiracy at Pointe Coupée in 1795 had been discovered before it even started. 23 men had been hanged, their bodies displayed along the river as warnings. White Louisiana remembered those warnings. They believed the lesson had been learned. They believed their system of control was unbreakable. What they did not know was that Charles had recruited leaders from plantations across 2 parishes. Men like Quamana, born in Africa, who remembered what freedom felt like. Men like Cook, whose anger burned cold and patient. Men like Harry Kenner, who had organized his own network of English-speaking recruits. Together, they had built something white Louisiana said could never exist. A coordinated conspiracy spanning dozens of plantations, involving hundreds of people, all keeping one secret. Tonight, that secret becomes a revolution. Charles gives the signal. His men surge forward into the Andry mansion. The largest armed rebellion in American history has begun. The attack is swift and brutal. Charles and his men burst into the Andry mansion. Manuel Andry wakes to chaos. Before he can reach his weapons, the rebels are on him. They strike him with cane knives and axes. They wound him badly, but in the darkness and confusion, Andry manages to escape through a window. He flees into the night, bleeding, desperate to reach the river and warn the militias. His son Gilbert is not so fortunate. The young man dies in the attack. First blood has been spilled. But there is no time to celebrate and no time to mourn. Charles knows that every minute counts. Andry is alive. He will raise the alarm. The window for this rebellion is measured in hours, not days. The men move quickly. They break into the basement and seize muskets, ammunition, and militia uniforms. Some of the rebels put on the uniforms. They are no longer workers. They are soldiers now. Then they begin to march. Plantation by plantation, they move down River Road toward New Orleans. At each estate, they call out to the people in the quarters. Join us. Fight with us. Freedom or death. And people join. Not everyone. Some are too afraid. Some do not believe it can work. But from every plantation, men and women step forward. 10 here, 15 there, 20 at the next estate. The numbers grow with every mile. By dawn, Charles commands more than 100 fighters. By midday, the number has swelled to over 200. Some accounts will later claim the army grew to 500 strong. They march in formation. Drummers beat out a rhythm. Men carry flags fashioned from stolen cloth. Officers ride on horseback at the front. Behind them, columns of fighters stretch down the road, armed with cane knives, axes, hoes, and pikes. A few carry muskets taken from plantation houses. White families flee in terror before them. They abandon their mansions and race toward New Orleans, screaming warnings of what is coming. The rebels set fire to plantation houses and sugar refineries. Smoke rises into the grey January sky. For the first time in their lives, these men and women are not property. They are an army. But the response is coming. Manuel Andry, despite his wounds, has crossed the river and rallied the local militia. Word has reached New Orleans. Governor William Claiborne orders a military response. General Wade Hampton mobilizes federal troops from the city. A second force under Major Homer Virgil Milton marches down from Baton Rouge. The rebels know they are outnumbered in firepower. They have axes and farm tools. The militia has rifles and artillery. They have passion and desperation. The militia has training and ammunition. On January the 10th, near the Benoudi plantation, the two forces collide. The militia attacks from the rear, catching the rebels off guard. Gunfire erupts. The rebels fight back with everything they have, but they are outmatched. They begin to run low on ammunition. The formation breaks apart. Men fall. Others scatter into the cane fields and swamps. Within half an hour, 40 to 45 rebels lie dead. The survivors disappear into the wetlands, hunted by militiamen with dogs and guns. But Charles Deslondes does not surrender. Wounded, exhausted, with his army shattered around him, he pushes deeper into the swamp. He refuses to stop. He refuses to be taken easily. They will have to hunt him down. For 2 days, Charles Deslondes evades capture. The swamps of Louisiana are deadly ground. Alligators glide through black water. Snakes coil in the roots of cypress trees. The mud pulls at every step. A man can disappear in these wetlands and never be found. But the militiamen have dogs. They have trackers. They have time and numbers and fury. On January 11th, the dogs find him. Charles is dragged from the swamp, covered in mud, exhausted from days of running. The militiamen recognize him immediately. This is the one they want. The driver, the organizer, the man who made white Louisiana tremble. They do not take him to trial. They do not ask him questions. They do not give him the dignity of legal proceedings. What happens next is designed to send a message. They bring Charles to an open field where other captured rebels can see, where the surrounding plantations can witness, where the lesson will be learned. First, they take his hands, the hands that gripped the cane knife, the hands that signaled the attack, the hands that reached for freedom. They chop them off and let him bleed. Then they shoot him in one thigh, then the other. They shatter his legs so he cannot stand, cannot run, cannot ever walk toward freedom again. Charles Deslondes is still alive. Any other man might beg, might scream for mercy, might offer names, locations, secrets, might do anything to make the pain stop. Charles gives them nothing. Through all of it, he does not betray a single person. He does not reveal the network he built. He does not expose the men and women who helped him plan. He does not hand the militia a list of conspirators to hunt down. His silence is his final act of war. They throw his broken body into a pile of straw. They set it on fire. The smoke rises over the German coast as Charles Deslondes burns. His screams carry across the fields. The militia intends those screams to terrify, to break the spirit of every black person within earshot, to prove that rebellion leads only to agony. But something else travels with that sound, something the militia does not intend. The people in the quarters hear those screams and they remember a man who refused to kneel, a man who built an army out of whispers, a man who proved that 500 people could organize in secret, march in military formation, and make the most powerful men in Louisiana run for their lives. They remember a man who looked at an impossible system and said no. Charles Deslondes was approximately 22 years old when he died. He had no grave, no marker, no official record of his burial. The men who killed him wanted him erased from history. But you cannot burn away what a man proves with his life. He proved that the people white Louisiana dismissed as incapable of thought could outthink their oppressors. He proved that the people they called docile could organize an army. He proved that the people they believed they controlled completely had been planning revolution right under their noses. His body died in that field. His proof lived on in every mind that witnessed what he accomplished. The rebellion was crushed, but something had been won that could never be taken back. For 3 days, between 200 and 500 black men and women had done the impossible. They had organized across dozens of plantations without detection. They had communicated in secret for months, while white overseers watched their every move. They had assembled an armed force, divided it into military companies, appointed officers, and marched more than 20 miles toward a major American city. No enslaved population in United States history had ever accomplished this. Consider what they achieved before a single shot was fired. They coordinated a conspiracy involving hundreds of people across 2 parishes. They kept that secret through months of planning. They armed themselves, uniformed themselves, and moved in disciplined formation with drums and flags. White Louisiana had sworn this was impossible. They had built their entire system on the belief that black people could not organize, could not strategize, could not lead. Charles Deslondes and his army proved them liars. The terror they inspired tells the true story of their impact. When word reached New Orleans that an army was marching toward the city, panic erupted. Governor Claiborne ordered every militiaman into immediate service. General Wade Hampton mobilized federal troops. Families barricaded themselves in their homes. The most powerful men in the territory dropped everything to respond to what a group of supposedly inferior people had built from nothing. The reaction after the rebellion reveals even more. The militia did not simply defeat the rebels and move on. They hunted survivors through swamps for days. They held rushed tribunals that condemned men to death within hours. They executed prisoners by firing squad and hanging. Then came the heads. Nearly 100 severed heads were placed on poles along the river road. They stretched for more than 40 miles, from the center of New Orleans deep into plantation country. One naval officer described the sight as looking like crows sitting on long poles. Why would the victors do this? Why such extreme brutality after the threat had already ended? Because they were terrified. Because they understood what had almost happened. Because they needed to convince themselves and everyone watching that this could never happen again. The display was not a sign of strength. It was a confession of fear. White plantation owners looked at those heads and saw their own nightmares made real. They saw proof that the people they held in bondage had been watching, learning, planning. They saw evidence that their system of control had failed completely. They saw a future where every driver, every houseworker, every field hand might be another Charles Deslondes waiting for the right moment. The territorial government responded with harsher restrictions on black movement and assembly. They tightened patrols. They increased surveillance. They made it harder for enslaved people to gather, to travel, to communicate. Every single one of those new laws was an admission that the old laws had not been enough, an admission that the people they called property had nearly brought their world crushing down. Charles Deslondes lost the battle, but he won something larger. He proved that rebellion was possible. He proved that hundreds could organize in secret. He proved that the system built to control black people could be beaten, even if only for 3 days. That proof could not be executed. That proof could not be mounted on a pole. That proof lived on. White Louisiana refused to speak the truth about what had happened. In official reports, Governor William Claiborne called the rebels brigands and bandits. Newspapers described them as a disorganized mob interested only in plunder and destruction. Court documents minimized the scale and coordination of the uprising. The narrative was carefully controlled. This was not a rebellion. This was criminal violence, quickly contained, nothing more. But their actions told a different story. Within days of crushing the rebellion, the territorial legislature began rewriting laws. They imposed stricter controls on black movement. They banned gatherings. They required written passes for anyone traveling between plantations. They increased patrols and expanded militia presence throughout the German coast. Why would they do this if the threat had been so insignificant? General Wade Hampton, one of the most powerful plantation owners in the South, personally led federal troops against the rebels. The governor of the Orleans Territory mobilized every available militiaman. A second military force marched from Baton Rouge. Artillery was deployed. Professional soldiers were called in. The United States government does not deploy federal troops against disorganized bandits. The display of 100 heads along 40 miles of river was not standard procedure for dealing with common criminals. It was a response to an existential threat. The brutality of that display revealed how close the plantation owners had come to losing everything. Newspapers across the South carried detailed reports of the uprising. From Virginia to Georgia, slaveholders read about what had happened in Louisiana and understood the message. It could happen anywhere. One historian would later discover that older black men in Louisiana were still telling the story of the 1811 rebellion to their grandchildren in 1923, more than a century after it occurred. The story passed down through generations, whispered in quarters and spoken in coded language. The authorities tried to erase Charles Deslondes from history, but the people who witnessed his rebellion would not let him be forgotten. The federal government quietly compensated plantation owners for the financial losses they suffered when their human property was killed. Congress approved payments. Bureaucrats processed claims. The system acknowledged, in the language of commerce, that something significant had been destroyed. Governor Claiborne wrote letters to President Thomas Jefferson describing the uprising. He did not call it insignificant. He requested additional military resources. He warned that the territory remained vulnerable. His private correspondence revealed what his public statements concealed: genuine alarm. The policy changes that followed the rebellion were perhaps the clearest admission of all. If enslaved people truly were incapable of organization and leadership, why strengthen the laws controlling their movement? If the uprising had really been the work of a few criminals, why transform the entire security apparatus of the territory? Every new restriction was a confession. Every increased patrol was an acknowledgement. Every tightened law was white Louisiana admitting that Charles Deslondes had done what they swore was impossible. They could execute the rebels. They could burn Charles Deslondes alive. They could mount heads on poles for 40 miles. But they could not undo what everyone had seen. For 3 days, an army of black men and women had marched in military formation toward New Orleans. They had organized in secret. They had armed themselves. They had terrified the most powerful territory in the South. The authorities never gave Charles Deslondes a trial, a record, or recognition. But they gave him something more lasting: proof that their entire system was built on a lie. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 remains the largest armed rebellion by enslaved people in United States history. Not Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, which most Americans learn about in school. Not the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. Not Denmark Vese's conspiracy in Charleston. Charles Deslondes commanded up to 500 fighters. He marched them more than 20 miles. He organized them across dozens of plantations. He kept the conspiracy secret for months. No other rebellion in American history matched that scale. Yet if you ask most Americans about rebellions during the era of enslavement, they will name Nat Turner. They will not name Charles Deslondes. This erasure was intentional. White Louisiana worked hard to minimize what happened on the German coast. They called it a riot, a disturbance, an outbreak of criminal violence. They buried the story in vague language and incomplete records. They made sure that future generations would not know the full truth of what Charles Deslondes accomplished. But the story survived anyway. Black families passed it down. Grandparents told grandchildren. Workers in the fields spoke of it in quiet voices. The authorities could control the newspapers and the history books, but they could not control memory. By the time of the Civil War, the children and grandchildren of the 1811 rebels were ready to finish what Charles Deslondes had started. Louisiana contributed more than 28,000 black soldiers to the Union Army, more than any other state. Those men marched with the knowledge of what their ancestors had dared to attempt. The rebellion also changed how the South approached control. After 1811, plantation owners could never again pretend that large-scale organization was impossible. The laws tightened. The patrols increased. The fear never left. In recent decades, historians have begun recovering the full story. In 1995, the African American History Alliance of Louisiana started holding annual commemorations of the uprising. Descendants of the rebels gather to honor their ancestors. Museums now tell the story that was hidden for so long. In 2019, artist Dred Scott organized a massive reenactment. More than 300 people dressed in period clothing and marched the original route along the Mississippi River. They carried flags and drums, just as the original rebels had. They marched past the oil refineries and shopping centers that now cover the old plantation lands. The Whitney Plantation, the first museum in Louisiana dedicated to telling the story of enslavement, features a memorial to the 1811 rebellion. 63 ceramic heads mounted on steel poles honor the men who died. Visitors walk past them and confront what happened on those riverbanks more than 2 centuries ago. Charles Deslondes has no grave. No monument marked his death for 200 years. The men who killed him tried to erase him completely, but they failed. His story endures because what he proved cannot be destroyed. He proved that people dismissed as incapable could organize an army. He proved that people called property could terrify their oppressors. He proved that the system built to control black Americans could be challenged, resisted, and shaken to its foundation. He led the largest rebellion in American history. And for 3 days in January 1811, he made white Louisiana understand what freedom looks like when 500 people decide they will accept nothing less.